I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
So I'm back for the second part of my series on the Federalist Papers, written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, three of the most famous American founding fathers. And we just finished up 4 sessions on Federalist 10. So if you haven't gone back and listened to that, please do. But this also can stand on its own. And by the way, this is a podcast of the Maurin Academy. If you want to find out more about the Maurin Academy, I will put the link to our website in the notes below. We have a Patreon. We have a full list of classes planned. We have a speaker series. And so check us out. So Federalist Paper 51, this is from the Yale Law website, by the way. You can find all the Federalist Papers there, avalon.law.yale.edu. And this one is: the structure of the government must furnish the proper checks and balances between the different departments. And this was either written by Hamilton or Madison. Apparently, we don't know which one. All right. So what I did last time, I plan to do this time again, which is to just kind of read through it and sort of decipher it, because the language is somewhat antiquated, and there are words and there are phrases that we just don't use anymore, making it difficult to understand. So when I need to explain, I will. To what expedient, then, shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? Okay, so again, they're talking about the new proposed Constitution, which is the Constitution that the United States currently has. They were arguing that we needed a stronger Constitution than the Articles of Confederation. And basically here, the question is, why and how should we maintain the separation of powers amongst the, quote, several departments of the federal government, which is laid down in the Constitution? And then they say, he says, whichever one it is says, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. All right, so when we discussed Federalist 10, we talked about some of these exterior provisions, as he puts it here. Okay, and including a big theme there was the republic needs to be big and far flung in territory, so that you don't have, it's not easy to have like collusion amongst a majority of people to form a violent majority faction that could then use part of the government to basically oppress the rights of the minority. So that's the exterior provisions. That's the kind of thing that he's talking about. And so, you know, it cannot be completely, there's an acknowledgement here that cannot completely be counted upon. And so we have to look at also the structure of the government, the interior structure, and try to devise it in its parts, the parts of the government, and the way that they relate to each other in such a way as that they will check each other. That's what it means by keeping each other in their proper places. So whatever these departments are, these different, quote, constituent parts, right, of the federal government, their job needs to be to keep each other in check. And what's going to happen is he's going to explain his idea for how to devise their relationships so that they do. Without presuming, he says, to undertake a full development of this important idea, I will hazard a few general observations which may perhaps place the idea in a clearer light and enable us to form a more correct judgment of the principles and structures of the government planned by the convention. Okay. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own. So each department in the federal government, and still, has not named the departments, but surely two of them are the executive and the legislative branch. Those two. It is evident that each department should have a will of its own. So, meaning that one should not be completely subordinate to the other. One should not be subordinate to the other, right? Now, I think John Locke, who inspired the founders, John Locke's idea was really actually that if anything was to have supremacy, it was the legislature. And the American founders did not completely adopt that idea, right? They wanted, I think, more of a balance between the two, the executive and the legislative. Anyway, so here now he's going to name what those departments are. He says, were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments of the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same foundation of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Okay, so in other words, if we were to completely follow this idea of each department, and here he's naming executive, legislative, and judiciary, if each department had totally a will of its own, then each one of them would be separately more or less chosen or elected or somehow chosen by the people, and would have no real communication with one another in the sense of at least subordination, where one commands and the other acts. Okay. But I have the feeling that this is not going to be convenient. So anyway, he says, perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may in contemplation appear. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. Here he is just saying it's really not practical for each of these branches of government to be both, chosen by the people or drawn from the people, or have it, at least its authority come from the people, and also that they have no real give and take with each other. You need to have them working together. So therefore, we must modify this perfection of separation, of powers. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, he says, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle, first because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select the mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. So here he's saying that, if the people, if all the judiciary was drawn from the selection of the people, then they wouldn't be qualified. Or another way to put this is, it's more important that the judiciary be qualified by, for instance, knowing what the law is and having studied law and studied court cases. It's more important for that to be the case than it is for the judiciary to be completely drawn from the people's will or beholden to the people's will. And then secondly, he says, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. And, so this is a notion of, these people need to have tenure. Tenure is the idea that, once you have kind of merited this position in the judiciary, it should be, it should be permanent. That's why our Supreme Court justices can hold the positions for life. And the reason why is because that gives them a sense of independence from, from whoever put them in place, right? And so you don't want the judges, especially Supreme Court judges, to sort of be subordinate to the authority of whoever conferred that authority upon them. In the case of the Supreme Court justices, the legislative branch in the United States. So we don't want them to feel as though they are dependent upon the legislature that appointed them, right? And both of those are because the judiciary is this special body that does something that's different. It's not supposed to just do what the people want. It's supposed to do what the law says. And in the case of the Supreme Court, that would be the Constitution. Okay, anyway. So then to move on, he says, it is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices, which means that they should not be dependent on the other branches of government for their pay. Okay, emoluments is pay, the pay that they get for doing their jobs. That's what's being said there. And you can imagine that if, there was a real direct connection between, okay, your pay is coming from the legislature, and that means that the legislature can basically remove your pay to pressure you. Okay, anyway, so were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular of payment, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. They wouldn't be independent. In other words, it would be a joke. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. Okay, here's a big story, right? So I'm going to read that again. The great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers into the same department, okay, meaning a real hedge or safeguard against one branch of government taking over all the powers of the other two, all right, consists in giving to those who administer each department, giving to those who are in charge of each branch of government, the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist the encroachment of the other departments, right? The people in the legislature need to have the self-interest even, right, as well as the constitutional means to be able to say, no, our job is to pass the laws. Our job is to supervise their implementation, right, to keep a watch over the execution of those done by the executive branch. Whatever it is that they claim, right, that they have the power to do, they should be jealous of that power and want to hang on to it. And the author here seems to think that this is a pretty predictable position for people to take, that, the person who sits in the seat has an interest in keeping that seat and its power, right, over against the other branches of government that might want to dictate to it, whether it's in the case of the legislature, if it's the executive or the judiciary, and that this is good, that they should want to protect their own turf, so to speak. So he says the provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate or equal to the danger of the attack. Okay. And this is key, this sentence. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? I'll stop for just a second and try to explain this a little bit more fully. We need a government, he's saying, that structurally puts people into these different positions or branches of government and gives them a self-interested reason, right, to stick to their own place and to guard its powers and its rights well, and to resist other branches of government interfering with those rights and powers. And the power that they have to do this must be equal to the danger of the attack, right? They must have enough ability to resist, enough capability to resist the attempts of other branches of government to encroach on their power. And somehow they're going to devise a system that they thought gave people in these branches the ability to check the attacks that might come against their power from the other branches. And the reason why this is going to work is because people have ambition, because they do not want to be walked over and trampled upon and not have any power. Especially, I would think, people in positions of power, right? So that's why ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and the interests of the man must be connected to the constitutional rights of the place. And then he sort of goes off on this somewhat, philosophic tangent here, where he says it may be a reflection on human nature that such things or devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. It's too bad, in other words, that we need to have these plans in place to stop people from abusing government power by trampling on the rights of the other branches of government. But however, we do need that because it's human nature to try to push to see just how much power you can wield, right? And if nobody pushes back, if nobody actually says no or does anything about it, men in general, he's saying here, human beings in general, will keep pushing. So this is human nature. So we need a government. It's very realistic in this way. We need a government where men have the ambition and the ability, the capability to legally push back. And he goes on with his, philosophy. If men were angels, he says, no government would be necessary. Right. And here he's just saying, if people were perfect, like maybe Jesus wanted them to be, and they were all like brotherly and cooperative and didn't want to take advantage or have too much of this or that, or just desire power, then we wouldn't even need government. We could live without it. But he says, if angels were to govern men as well, we wouldn't need government. Neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary, right? If God was governing us directly, right, we also wouldn't need real government, right? Because we would have the most heavenly of governments, right? But that's not happening right now, okay? So they're saying, no, it's not enough. In fact, I think what they're saying there is it's not enough for Christians to think, or other religious believers to think, that their faith alone is enough to kind of help them maintain self-control and bring peace among people and get things done. No. Okay. So we're not angels, and angels don't govern us. And then he says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. This is just wonderful writing from Hamilton or Madison here, right? And when you make a government that is made by men and conducted by men over other men, then this great difficulty, in other words, this challenge is evident. This is the challenge, that first, the government needs to control the governed, The government needs to control the people in a way, right? To law and order. Okay. But in the next place, the next thing it needs to do is we need to figure out how government can control itself so that it provides order, but it doesn't trample on others' rights, and where a particular branch of government doesn't basically abuse the rights and privileges of the other branches of government. Only if these branches of government can stay in balance and watch carefully and jealously over their own power and check other branches' power can the people be free. Okay, so this is a good place to stop here, right? Like, but this paragraph says so much, and I think that it is well worth really contemplating here the wisdom of this, right? Now, we all wish that men were angels, right? And some of us wish that angels could govern men, but neither one of those things exists. Realistically, we do have to control both people bringing order, but also the government. And so in the rest of this Federalist paper, Hamilton or Madison is going to explain further their ideas of how to get this done. All right, so we'll see you next time.